Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest.
Segregation is the practice of restricting people to certain circumcised areas of residence or to separate facilities based on their race or social status. There have been many well-known instances of racial segregation throughout the course of history, but American segregation is arguably one of the most common examples.
From 1964 to 67, there was fierce rioting in cities across the US, as African Americans found that the civil rights movement left them as poor as ever.
Well, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. saw the failure. He said it himself. He said, look, the first part of the movement, relatively speaking, was a piece of cake. Because it was easy for America. Civil rights bill, doesn't cost much. Give people the right to vote, doesn't cost much. But now what we're doing, the second part of the movement, the part about economic equality and social injustice, oh, that's going to cost something. It's not about just letting us have access to the lunch counter. Martin Luther King Jr. said, what good is it to be able to go to a lunch counter but can't afford to buy the hamburger?
Lord have mercy on the land of mine. We all gonna get it in due time. I don't belong here, I don't belong there.
Though slavery had been abolished, through the 1900s stretching to the 1960s, African Americans still faced major segregation and discrimination in their everyday lives. Trying to perform basic tasks, such as going to work, attending school, and eating at a restaurant came with great difficulty for African Americans.
Just the trouble, too slow. Washing the windows, too slow. Picking the cotton, too slow. We're just plain rotten, too slow. We're too damn lazy, too slow.
Millions living in the land of the free found themselves trapped by the Jim Crow system, named after a vaudeville act that ridiculed black people.
The key thing to grasp about the so-called Jim Crow laws is that they were really about enforcing the idea of racial inequality in everyday life. And so there were laws that explicitly governed things like where black people could sit in buses, whether they could stay in hotels, which hotels they could stay in, whether they could eat in the same places and so on. But also around them was a set of practices of everyday life which were not legally enforceable, but which reflected the very same ideas. So, for example, black people weren't supposed to look white people in the face in the street. I mean, if there was not enough space on the pavement, the black person was supposed to get off. Or in the end, if you looked in the wrong place, if you did what was once called reckless eyeballing, if a black man looked at a white woman in the wrong way, he could end up being lynched.
That's just the trouble. Desegregation, mass participation.
Comparing the way of life during times of segregation to now results in the shocking realization that African Americans were prohibited from simply living the lives they deserved. They weren't free to unconditionally be who they wanted to be or love someone who didn't look the same as them. In the states of Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Virginia all had laws in place prohibiting interracial marriage, also known as anti-miscegenation laws.
There are 190,000 colored people in this country. People say that the color bar is beginning to fade, but I wonder if it is. I think if we were honest with ourselves, that we'd admit it would be a bit of a shock if we were told that our sister or daughter was going to marry a colored man. With me here is Mr. Jackson from Jamaica,
with his English wife Olive and their 3-year-old son John. An example of an extremely happy and successful mixed marriage.
How long have you been married?
5 years.
And how long had you known each other before you did get married?
3 months. So.
Well, did you discuss all the disadvantages of a mixed marriage in this country?
Well, we didn't talk about it much, really. We both knew that there's a certain amount of prejudice to be combated, but we felt prepared to to deal with it as it came along, as best we could.
But what sort of prejudice have you come up against?
Well, to be honest, I must say that we haven't faced any real direct prejudice which you could pin it down and say such and such thing is prejudice, you know? I mean, you've had people staring at you in buses and things like that, but I don't suppose it's prejudice. I suppose it's bad manners. I'm not quite sure whether it's the welfare state or prosperity that's responsible for that, but it's just bad manners, you know?
And you've no fear that John is going to be prejudiced over here?
I think he might meet with a few little indifferent things, but he'll have to be trained in such a way to get on top of them. See, that's our job, more or less, you know, to get him in the right frame of mind, the right proper breeding that he can overcome the little difficulties which he may find out.
It was up until 1967 that these laws were removed and American people were free to love outside of their race, and it all came down to Richard and Mildred Loving. The time was 2 a.m. on July 11, 1958, when a police officer barged in on Richard and Mildred Loving in their own home. The crime? Interracial marriage. According to the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which was a series of laws created to ensure that racial mixing of any kind did not take place. The couple was then arrested. While Richard spent one night in jail after being released on a $1,000 bond, Mildred was not allowed bond and was held in an isolated cell for 3 days while pregnant before being released into her father's care. In court, the couple pled guilty and were faced with the decision to leave Virginia or go to prison. Though they were able to avoid jail time, they were forced to leave their family, friends, and the lives they had known since they were children behind. Moving to Washington, D.C., they had nothing except for each other. But in the long run, that proved to be enough. Over time, the longing for their country life back home became too much to bear. The Lovings returned to Virginia and did their best to never be seen with each other. But in 1964, Mildred had decided that enough was enough. So she wrote a letter to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who directed her to the American Civil Liberties Union. From there, ACLU lawyers Bernard S. Cohen and Philip J. Hickerschlop took the case. They first attempted to get the judge to repeal the court order, but after waiting almost a year in response, they brought a class action suit to the U.S. District Court of the Eastern District of Virginia, which finally elicited a response from Judge Beisel. He stated, "Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. But for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix." This prejudice-filled response provided the grounds for an appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeal. But that court upheld the original ruling. Though the Lovings didn't appear in court, Richard sent a letter to the judge that said, "Tell the court I love my wife, and it's just not fair that I can't live with her in Virginia." In result, the judges agreed with the unanimous vote that the interracial marriage laws were deemed unconstitutional. Finally, the laws had been lifted. It took nearly 10 years, but the Lovings were finally able to live their lives together in Virginia with their family and friends. Though interracial marriage had become legal, there were still many obstacles of segregation that people of color had to face. But because of what had initially been a tragic event, humiliating the Lovings and violating their rights, future interracial couples were able to have the right to love each other. The Lovings changed history for the better. Without their lasting impact, America may not be what it is today.
Got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest, and everybody knows about me.